It was a bright morning when a man walked down the busy street toward a large department store that had just opened for the day. The city was alive with movement, cars honking, people rushing to work, and shopkeepers pulling open shutters. He moved at an unhurried pace, dressed in a simple but neat suit. His shoes shined softly in the light, and he carried himself with quiet confidence, though he gave no sign of being in a rush or of having any particular importance. To anyone passing by, he was just another customer, maybe someone coming to look around before buying something. The store itself was one of the most well-known in the city. It sold everything from expensive clothes and accessories to fine watches and shoes. The front window sparkled with bright displays designed to catch the attention of people walking past. Posters of models in new season outfits smiled down, and the doors opened smoothly as the man stepped inside. Cool air brushed against him as he entered, the kind of carefully managed air that always hung in such luxury places. Inside, the lights shone bright, reflecting off the glass counters and polished floors. He took a slow look around. The store was not yet crowded, only a handful of people moving between sections. Staff members stood in neat lines near their counters, ready to greet customers. Some were fixing displays, arranging ties, or folding shirts, but most stood tall and watchful, waiting for someone to approach. The man walked with an easy pace, his eyes scanning the details, not just the products but also the way people behaved, how the staff spoke, how the store seemed to move like a living machine. He was not in a hurry to buy. He was here to watch, to understand, to feel the place. A salesman by one of the clothing sections noticed him. The salesman was younger, dressed smartly in a sharp shirt and tie with hair neatly styled. He had been standing idly, waiting for what he thought might be a real customer. When he first noticed the man entering, his eyes narrowed just a little. He did not see a potential buyer worth much attention. To him, the man looked plain, ordinary, someone unlikely to spend thousands on the luxury suits or watches in the store. Still, he walked over with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, sir," the salesman said, his tone polite but distant. "Looking for something today?" The man returned the smile, soft and warm, though he could sense the distance in the salesman's voice. "Just browsing for now. Thought I'd take a look around." "Of course," the salesman said quickly, already turning slightly as though he had other things to do. He gave a half nod, then stood back, his eyes drifting past the man to the glass doors, clearly waiting for a different kind of customer. He stayed nearby, but not with real interest. His body language showed that he believed this visitor wasn't worth much of his time. The man did not seem bothered. He walked slowly toward a row of neatly arranged jackets. Each one hung perfectly on its hanger, the fabric smooth and rich. He touched one lightly, running his hand along the sleeve as though feeling the weight of the cloth. His face carried the calm curiosity of someone who truly appreciated detail. The salesman, however, stood behind him with folded arms, tapping his foot lightly. He made no effort to explain the jackets or share details. He simply waited as if he wanted the man to move on quickly. As the man moved from jackets to shoes, then to a display of watches, the salesman followed at a small distance. From time to time, he sighed under his breath. If another customer walked in, someone dressed in flashier clothes, perhaps wearing a visible designer watch, his eyes lit up, and he seemed more ready to move. Yet when his gaze returned to the man, the light faded, replaced by impatience. It was clear he had already judged who was worthy of his attention. The man noticed this behavior. He noticed the glances, the tone, the way he was being half ignored. But instead of reacting with anger or irritation, he stayed calm. He had a reason for being here, and it wasn't just to shop. He wanted to see, to feel, to know how people like this salesman treated customers when they believed no one important was watching. He understood the salesman's thoughts without needing them spoken. He knew the salesman had measured him, placed him in a box, and decided he wasn't valuable. But he said nothing. He kept browsing. He picked up a wallet from the accessories counter, opened it, and looked at the stitching. "Nice work," he said softly, almost to himself. The salesman finally stepped forward, but his voice lacked enthusiasm. "Yes, Italian leather. But we have others that are more popular." The man smiled politely. "I see, and what about this watch?" He pointed toward a glass display case with elegant timepieces resting inside. The salesman's smile stiffened. "Those are the premium range," he said carefully, his eyes flicking over the man once more, judging. "They're very expensive. Perhaps you'd like to see something from the lower collection first. The words were gentle on the surface but carried a sting beneath. The assumption was clear. He didn't believe this customer could afford the premium range. He leaned slightly on the counter. His body relaxed in a way that showed he didn't expect much to come from this conversation. The man's expression did not change. He only nodded slowly, his eyes still on the watches. "Interesting," he murmured, as if noting more than just the watch itself. Around them, a few other shoppers moved by. One or two paused, noticing the way the salesman spoke, the way the man was being handled with such coldness. Some frowned slightly, but no one stepped in. It was not their place. The store remained calm, quiet except for the background music and the soft shuffle of shoes on polished floors. The man continued to move through the store, pausing at different items. Sometimes he asked a question, and each time the salesman gave clipped answers, never offering detail, never sharing the kind of care he gave to other customers. When a woman entered wearing a sparkling necklace and carrying a designer bag, the salesman's face lit up. He excused himself from the man without a word and rushed over to greet her warmly, his voice suddenly full of charm and energy. The difference was striking, obvious to anyone paying attention. The man stayed where he was, watching quietly as the salesman fussed over the woman, showing her different items, laughing at her small jokes. For a moment he simply observed the contrast. Then he turned back to the shelves, still calm, still patient. He had seen enough to understand the salesman's heart. Minutes stretched on, the salesman continuing to juggle his attention, giving little more than passing remarks whenever the man asked something. To him, the man was nothing special, nothing to be concerned about. He could not have known the truth that the man he was treating so carelessly was not only a customer but also someone who now held the power to shape the future of the very store he worked in. The man wandered toward the corner of the store. His eyes caught the reflection in a tall mirror. He saw himself standing there in his modest suit, calm and quiet, and behind him the salesman leaning lazily against a counter. It made him think about the thousands of customers who might have walked through these doors, people who were also judged by their appearance, their clothes, their accent, or the color of their skin. How many had been made to feel unwelcome, dismissed before they even had a chance to speak? The thought settled heavy in his chest, but he kept his composure. He knew the lesson he wanted to give would come soon. For now he allowed the moment to stretch to let the salesman continue in his ways. Because sometimes people reveal the most about themselves when they believe no one important is watching. And so, the man remained, walking slowly through the shining aisles, while the salesman stood unaware of the truth, unaware that this ordinary-looking customer was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The morning moved along, and more customers started entering the store. The air filled with soft footsteps, quiet conversations, and the faint music that floated from the speakers above. The man continued to walk through the aisles, calm and steady, his hands occasionally brushing against fabrics or pausing over items on display. He still wore the same peaceful smile, though he noticed every small detail, how the staff treated each person, how the atmosphere changed depending on who entered, and how the salesman's attitude toward him stayed the same. The salesman returned to his side after giving his full charm to another customer. His face carried that same polite mask, but his tone was flat, without warmth. "Is there anything specific you want to see, sir?" he asked, though the words carried impatience. He spoke as if he hoped the man would give up soon and leave. The man looked at him calmly and asked, "Could you show me that jacket there?" "The one in dark gray." The salesman hesitated for a second, then pulled it off the rack. His movements were quick, not careful, as though the jacket wasn't important. He held it out, his eyes already wandering toward the entrance where another well-dressed couple was stepping in. "This one is very high-end," he said, his voice lowering just slightly. "The price is quite high. Perhaps I can show you something simpler?" The man ran his hand along the sleeve and nodded slowly. "It feels good," he said. "How much is it?" The salesman shifted, clearly uncomfortable. It's around $1,200, he replied, then quickly added, "But we have jackets for half that price, which might suit you better." The words hung in the air, and though they were spoken softly, their meaning was sharp. The man smiled faintly, his expression calm, but inside he noted how easily the salesman had judged him, deciding what he could or could not afford without even asking. He handed the jacket back gently. "I see," he said simply. As he placed it back on the rack, the salesman's attention again drifted toward the couple at the entrance. His eyes lit up, his body straightened, and his voice changed. "Please excuse me a moment," he said, before walking off quickly toward them, leaving the man standing alone by the jackets. The couple received warm greetings, laughter, and detailed explanations of products, while the man stood quietly, continuing to observe. He watched how the salesman leaned in toward the couple, offering suggestions, showing them the finest items and treating them like treasures. Then the salesman glanced back toward him, his eyes dull again as though wishing the man would simply vanish. The man turned toward another section, this time the shoe display. Rows of polished leather shoes lined the shelves, each shining under the lights. He bent slightly to examine a pair, admiring the craftsmanship. A different staff member, noticing him, walked over politely and asked if he needed assistance. Their voice was warm, their smile genuine, but before the man could answer, the original salesman rushed over, almost cutting in between them. "I've got this," he said sharply to his colleague, then turned to the man with a forced smile. "Those shoes are, well, they're not for everyone. Very high in price. Perhaps you'd like to see something more basic from the back." The man looked at him thoughtfully. "Why do you think these aren't for me?" The salesman blinked, caught off guard, then forced a small laugh. "Oh, no reason, just you might find something else more practical. These are more for special customers." The man's calm eyes stayed on him, unshaken. "I see," he said again, the same quiet tone as before. His voice carried no anger, but it carried weight. He placed the shoe back on the shelf with care. Other shoppers nearby had begun noticing the exchanges. A few looked uncomfortable, whispering quietly to each other. They saw the difference in how the salesman treated one man compared to the others, but no one spoke up. They simply watched, uneasy. The salesman, however, was too caught up in his own assumptions to see the bigger picture. He continued his pattern, warm and eager with certain customers, cold and dismissive with the man who walked in quietly. His impatience grew as the minutes ticked by. To him, this man wasn't worth the effort. He wanted to focus on customers who, in his eyes, looked more like they belonged in a luxury store. The man walked toward the watches again, his gaze settling on a particularly fine piece inside the glass case. Its design was classic, elegant, the kind of watch that carried quiet dignity rather than loud show. He paused, studying it with real appreciation. "Could I see this one, please?" he asked softly. The salesman's lips pressed into a thin line. "That one is one of our most expensive models," he said, his tone heavy with warning. "It's not something most people can afford. Maybe I can show you a cheaper one from the other side?" The man turned his head slowly to look at him, his eyes steady but kind. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He only asked, "Do you believe I cannot afford it?" The salesman shifted on his feet, his face flushing slightly. "I'm just trying to save you some time," he said quickly, avoiding the man's gaze. "That watch isn't practical for everyone." The man's smile widened a little, though it carried sadness now. "Interesting," he said softly. He looked back at the watch, his eyes calm, his hands folded lightly in front of him. He had no need to press further. The salesman had revealed enough with his own words. A silence hung between them for a moment before the salesman cleared his throat and stepped back, pretending to rearrange some items on the counter. He wanted the conversation to end, to move on to someone he thought was more valuable. He had no idea that every word, every dismissive gesture was being quietly recorded in the memory of the man standing before him. The man turned and began walking slowly toward the back of the store. Each step was measured, calm, and his face showed no anger, only thought. He passed rows of shelves, other staff members, and customers who gave him brief glances. He could feel the salesman's eyes on his back, relieved perhaps that he was finally leaving the main area. But he wasn't leaving. He was simply moving, giving space, letting the story unfold naturally. He knew that sometimes the strongest lessons reveal themselves not in loud confrontations, but in the quiet moments when truth comes to light. And here, in this store full of shining displays and polished floors, the truth had already begun to show itself. The store had grown busier now, with the sound of people moving through aisles, the hum of soft conversations, and the faint background music. The man walked quietly, his hands behind his back, his expression thoughtful. He paused here and there to look at items, but his mind was not on the products. He was paying attention to people, the way staff behaved, the tone of their voices, the difference in warmth and coldness depending on who stood in front of them. It was all clear to him, and yet he remained calm as though he had all the time in the world. The salesman trailed behind, always keeping an eye on him, though his interest was shallow. He gave the man little attention, but he stayed close enough to make sure he wasn't lingering too long by the most expensive items. Every time the man touched something valuable, the salesman's body stiffened and his voice grew sharp. Yet when others stepped in, people dressed in fine clothes or speaking in loud, confident tones, his voice melted into charm. At one point, the man stopped by a tall rack of suits. They were neatly arranged, every jacket perfectly pressed, every sleeve in line. He placed his hand on a deep navy suit, the fabric soft under his fingers. He admired the detail, the stitching, the care put into the making. With quiet interest, he asked, "Could I try this one on?" The salesman's eyebrows shot up. He hesitated, then forced a tight smile. "This is from one of our premium collections," he said. His voice carried the same edge as before. "It's very costly. Maybe it would be better if I showed you something less exclusive." The man met his eyes. His gaze was calm, steady, but it carried weight. "I would still like to try it on," he said softly but firmly. The salesman gave a small sigh, but he pulled the suit off the rack and handed it over. "All right, but be careful with it," he muttered, his tone clipped. He guided the man toward the fitting room with the air of someone doing a chore, not serving a customer. Inside the fitting room, the man put on the jacket and stood in front of the mirror. It fit him almost perfectly, draping over his shoulders with quiet elegance. He looked at his reflection, at the way the suit rested against his frame. There was no need for show. It simply spoke of quiet dignity. He stood there for a moment, thoughtful, then stepped out to show the salesman. The salesman glanced at him, then quickly looked away, unimpressed. "Yes, that's fine," he said, almost dismissive. "But it's really not practical. Too expensive for most." The man smoothed the front of the jacket with his hand, still calm. He tilted his head slightly as though weighing not just the suit but the moment itself. Then he asked, "And how much does it cost?" $2,000, the salesman replied, his tone sharp like a warning. Then he added quickly, "But honestly, sir, I think something cheaper would suit you better." The man let the words hang in the air for a moment, then quietly returned to the fitting room. He removed the suit carefully, hung it back on its hanger, and stepped out again. His face carried the same calm expression, but his eyes had grown sharper now. He was not angry, but there was a strength behind his silence. He walked toward the watch counter once again. His eyes returned to the elegant watch he had admired earlier, the one inside the glass case that the salesman had refused to show him properly. He stopped in front of it and asked once more, "Could you please let me see this watch?" The salesman shifted, his voice growing tense. "Sir, I already told you that watch is extremely expensive. It's not something everyone can just try on." The man's voice was soft but firm. "I would like to see it." The salesman's face hardened and his patience snapped. "Look," he said, his voice low but sharp. "I don't want to waste time. This watch costs more than most people make in months. You don't need to handle it if you're not buying." A silence spread across the space. Nearby shoppers paused, their eyes turning toward the two men. They had heard the sharpness in the salesman's voice, the way he had dismissed the customer so openly. The air in the store grew heavy. People exchanged uneasy glances but stayed quiet, unsure what would happen next. The man did not flinch. He stood tall, his expression still calm, though his eyes now carried a quiet power. He looked at the salesman for a long moment, then said in a steady voice, "Call your manager." "I would like to speak with them." The salesman blinked, startled. His confidence wavered for the first time. "The manager?" he asked quickly, as though unsure he had heard correctly. "Yes," the man replied simply. "Please call them here." The salesman hesitated, his face pale, but he could not refuse. The calm authority in the man's voice left no room for argument. He muttered something under his breath and hurried away, weaving through the aisles toward the manager's office. The shoppers who had been watching now whispered among themselves. Some nodded quietly, as if glad the man had stood his ground. Others looked toward the back of the store, waiting to see how the manager would react. The air was charged with curiosity. The man remained where he was, standing quietly by the glass counter. He folded his hands in front of him and waited with the same calm patience he had carried since he entered. There was no anger in his face, only certainty. He knew what he was doing. He knew the time had come for the truth to be revealed. After a few minutes, footsteps echoed through the store. The salesman returned, followed by the store manager, a person in a sharp suit whose eyes immediately scanned the situation. The manager looked at the man, and the moment their eyes met, recognition flashed. The manager's expression shifted instantly, from confusion to shock, then to nervous respect. Their voice softened as they stepped forward. "Sir," they said quickly, "I didn't know you were coming today." The salesman froze, his face draining of color. He looked between the man and the manager, confusion and fear spreading across his features. Something had just changed in a way he could not understand. The man gave a polite nod to the manager. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried weight. "I wanted to see how things run here," he said quietly. "And now I think I've seen enough." The salesman's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The customers nearby leaned closer, sensing the moment had taken a dramatic turn. None of them knew who the man truly was, but it was clear now. He was not an ordinary shopper. The store had shifted. The air was different. The salesman, who had carried himself with arrogance, now stood trembling, unsure of what was about to unfold. The air inside the store felt heavier than before. The manager stood stiffly, their eyes darting between the man and the nervous salesman. Customers nearby lingered quietly, pretending to browse, though everyone could feel the tension. Something unusual was happening, and no one wanted to miss it. The manager stepped closer, their tone soft, full of respect. "Sir," they said, "if we had known you were coming today, we would have prepared properly. Please forgive any inconvenience." The salesman's face twisted in confusion. He could not understand why his manager, usually so strict and commanding, was suddenly speaking in such a careful, almost fearful way. He stared at the man he had dismissed all morning, struggling to connect the pieces. "Prepared?" he muttered under his breath, though no one was listening to him. The man simply stood still, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He looked at the manager for a moment before saying, "I didn't come here to be prepared for. I came to see the truth." The manager swallowed, their eyes flicking nervously toward the salesman. A quiet sigh escaped their lips. "I understand," they said, bowing their heads slightly. The salesman finally found his voice. "Wait," he said quickly, his tone sharper than it should have been. "What's going on here? Who is he?" The manager turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "Show some respect," they snapped, their voice carrying authority. The salesman flinched, stunned. Never before had the manager spoken to him like that. He looked at the man again, this time with fear creeping in. His earlier arrogance melted away, replaced with uncertainty. The man took a slow step forward, his gaze steady. His words came out soft, but they filled the space with weight. "I am not just a customer," he said. "I am the new chairman of this company, the company that owns this very store." The words hit like a wave. The salesman's eyes widened in shock. His jaw dropped, but no sound came out. The customers standing nearby gasped softly, their whispers buzzing like low thunder through the air. The staff members behind counters stood frozen, their hands stiff on the items they had been arranging. Everything stopped for a moment, as if the whole store had taken a breath and held it. The salesman's face went pale. His body felt weak, as though his legs might give out. He shook his head slightly, as if refusing to believe what he had just heard. You're the chairman?" he stammered, his voice trembling. I didn't know." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the salesman's. "Yes," he said simply, "and I know you didn't know. That is exactly why I came here this way. I wanted to see how customers are treated when you don't think anyone important is watching." The silence that followed was thick, pressing down on everyone. The salesman's breathing grew heavy, his chest rising and falling quickly. Regret filled his eyes as the memory of every dismissive word and impatient glance came flooding back. He remembered how he had waved the man off, how he had suggested cheaper items again and again, how he had refused to let him even touch the fine watch. His face burned with shame. The manager shifted uncomfortably, bowing slightly again. "Sir, please understand," they said quietly. "We will handle this matter right away. This is not how we want our store to be represented." The man lifted a hand gently, stopping the manager's words. His voice remained calm, but it carried the strength of someone who was not here for excuses. "What I saw today is not just about one person," he said, glancing briefly around the store. "It is about attitude. It is about respect. It is about the way people are judged the moment they walk through those doors. Every word sank deep into the air, reaching not just the salesman, but also the other staff who stood silently, listening. Some lowered their heads, guilt clear in their faces, while others looked shaken as if realizing how easily such mistakes could happen. The salesman swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "Sir, I didn't mean any harm. I thought—" His words trailed off, weak and empty. The man's gaze stayed steady, not cruel but unshakable. "You thought I didn't belong," he finished for him. "You thought I wasn't worth your time. You thought you could judge me by my appearance before you even knew who I was." The salesman opened his mouth, but no defense came. He lowered his eyes, ashamed, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. The man turned his attention back to the manager. "I came here quietly because I wanted to know how real customers are treated," he said. "Today I was treated as though my presence was an inconvenience, as though I was not worth the same respect given to others." The manager bowed their head deeply, their voice humble. "You are right, sir. There is no excuse. We failed today." The customers standing nearby nodded quietly to each other. Some whispered words of agreement. They had seen it with their own eyes. The difference in treatment, the unfairness. The moment felt larger than just one incident. It was a lesson everyone in the room could feel. The man walked slowly toward the counter where the expensive watch still rested under the glass. He looked at it once more, then turned to the salesman. "You said I should not touch this because I could not afford it," he said softly. "But the truth is, this watch and many more like it are under my responsibility now. Not because of wealth, but because I was trusted to lead this company, and leadership means ensuring that every customer who walks in here feels valued." The salesman's throat tightened. His hands clenched and unclenched nervously. He wanted to disappear to undo the morning, but it was too late. The man straightened, his calm voice carrying to every corner of the store. "This is not about money. It is not about status. It is about respect. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity. No one should ever feel dismissed, no matter how they look, no matter what you assume about them." The words rang out like truth carved into stone. The silence afterward was powerful, almost sacred. Every staff member felt the weight of the lesson. The customers who had witnessed the scene nodded quietly, some with thoughtful expressions, others with admiration. The salesman lowered his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said. His apology was weak, but it was all he could give in that moment. The man looked at him for a long moment, then finally said, "Sorry is only the beginning. What matters is change." The manager stepped forward again, nodding quickly. "We will make changes immediately, sir. Training, stricter guidance, whatever is needed. This will not happen again." The man gave a small nod, his calm expression unchanged. "See that it doesn't. This store is more than products. It is an image of who we are as a company. If respect is missing, then everything else loses its meaning." He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping across the room, making sure every staff member heard him clearly. "Every person matters. That is the standard we will hold from now on." The tension eased slightly, though the lesson still hung heavy in the air. The customers who had been watching began to move again, though more quietly than before, carrying with them the weight of what they had just seen. The staff members stood straighter, their eyes lowered, deeply aware of the moment. The salesman, pale and shaken, stood frozen, his earlier arrogance shattered. He had not just embarrassed himself, he had revealed the very weakness the new chairman had come to uncover. The man gave one last look around the store, then returned his gaze to the manager. "I'll be back," he said softly, "and next time I hope to see something different." The manager bowed their head deeply again. "Yes, sir. You will." With that, the man turned and began to walk toward the exit. The customers stepped aside respectfully as he passed. His steps were calm, steady, carrying the same quiet dignity he had shown all along. But now everyone knew who he truly was. The man they had seen dismissed as ordinary was the very person who now held the future of the store in his hands. And with each step, the lesson lingered, a reminder that respect should never be reserved for appearances, but given freely to all. The doors of the store opened and closed as people went in and out, but inside, the atmosphere still carried the weight of what had just happened. The man had already revealed who he was, and every staff member knew their world had changed. The customers who had witnessed the moment would remember it for a long time. The salesman, standing stiff and pale, kept his eyes low, his chest tight with regret. The manager tried to maintain order, speaking quietly with staff members, but everyone's mind was still on the scene that had unfolded minutes earlier. The man did not storm out in anger, nor did he make a show of his authority. Instead, he moved calmly, choosing to leave a stronger impression through silence and dignity. But before he reached the door, he paused and turned back. His eyes swept over the store one more time, taking in the staff, the manager, and finally the salesman. His voice, when it came, was steady but carried the kind of weight that no one could ignore. "This is not the end of this lesson," he said softly, though every ear caught his words. "This is the beginning." The manager stepped forward quickly, their hands clasped in front of them. "Yes, sir," they said. "We will make sure it never happens again." The man nodded once, then left the store. His footsteps faded into the noise of the street outside, but the silence he left behind seemed louder than anything. Everyone knew the moment was not over. It would carry forward, shaping the future of the store, the staff, and especially the salesman who had been at the center of it all. The rest of the day moved differently. Customers who came in still shopped, but the staff were more cautious, more polite, more careful with every word. The salesman tried to keep working, but his hands trembled each time he approached someone. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, the weight of his mistake pressing down. The easy arrogance he once carried was gone, replaced by the heavy awareness that he had disrespected the very person who now led the company. That night, after the store closed, the manager gathered the staff for a meeting. The air was tense. Everyone sat quietly waiting. The manager's voice was serious as they began to speak. "What happened today was unacceptable. We were given a direct example of what it looks like when respect is missing. We all saw it. We all heard it. And we all know it cannot continue." The salesman sat with his head low, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The manager looked around the room, their gaze sharp. "From this day on, things will change. No more assumptions. No more judgments based on appearance. Every single customer will be treated with dignity and care no matter who they are." Some staff members nodded firmly, others shifted uncomfortably, but all understood the seriousness of the moment. The salesman raised his head slightly, his voice weak but clear. I want to apologize to everyone," he said. "I was wrong. I didn't just embarrass myself, I embarrassed this store, this company. I know I can't erase what happened, but I promise I'll change." The manager's eyes stayed on him for a long time before they gave a short nod. "We will see," they said simply. The meeting ended soon after, but the memory of the day did not fade. In the following weeks, the chairman returned, not with anger but with purpose. He visited unannounced, walking quietly through the aisles just as he had before. This time, however, the staff treated him differently, not because they recognized him, but because they had learned to treat everyone differently. Smiles were warmer, voices more genuine, and the air in the store felt lighter, more welcoming. Customers noticed. People who once might have felt out of place now felt comfortable. The salesman, too, was different. The arrogance was gone. He moved carefully, speaking with respect to every person he met. Sometimes his voice trembled with nerves, but with time he grew steadier. The memory of that day stayed with him, a constant reminder of what happens when judgment replaces kindness. He knew he had been given a chance and he did not want to waste it. One afternoon, the chairman returned again. He moved through the store quietly, watching, listening. He noticed how the staff smiled at each customer, how they offered help without assumption, how the store felt more alive. When he reached the clothing section, he saw the salesman helping an older gentleman pick out a suit. The salesman's tone was patient, respectful, full of care. He helped the customer try on different jackets, offering honest advice without pressure. There was no trace of the coldness he had once shown. When the customer left, smiling with his new purchase, the chairman stepped forward. The salesman froze for a moment, recognizing him instantly. His voice shook as he said, "Sir, welcome back." The chairman studied him quietly, then gave a small nod. "I've been watching," he said softly. "And I see change." The salesman's eyes filled with both relief and shame. "I will never forget what I did that day," he admitted. "But I want to make sure it never happens again to anyone." The chairman's expression softened. "That is all I wanted," he said. "Not just for you, but for this store, for everyone. Respect should not depend on who you think someone is. It should always be given freely." The salesman bowed his head. "Thank you for giving me another chance," he said quietly. The chairman gave a faint smile. "Everyone deserves the chance to learn," he replied. Then, without another word, he walked on, continuing to observe the rest of the store. Word of the changes spread beyond the walls. Customers who had once felt uneasy began returning, telling friends about how welcome they now felt. The reputation of the store grew stronger, not just for its products but for the way people were treated. And though not everyone knew the story of the day the chairman came quietly to test the store, the impact of that day was felt in every corner. For the staff, it became a story they told each other, not as gossip but as a reminder. A reminder that you never truly know who is standing in front of you. A reminder that appearances mean nothing compared to character. And most of all, a reminder that respect costs nothing but changes everything. As for the salesman, the lesson stayed with him for the rest of his life. He carried it into every interaction, inside and outside of work. He often thought back to the moment when he realized the man he had dismissed was the very leader of the company. The shame was deep, but the growth that followed was real. He knew he had been given a gift, not of forgiveness alone, but of transformation. The chairman continued his quiet visits, never announcing himself, always blending in with the flow of customers. And every time he was treated with respect, not because people recognized him, but because the culture had changed. The staff had learned the true meaning of service. And so the story reached its quiet end, not with punishment, but with growth. The salesman who had once judged wrongly became the strongest example of change. The store became a place known not just for luxury items, but for kindness. And the chairman's lesson lived on. Status is invisible, but respect should always be visible. The weeks turned into months, and what had begun as a single moment of tension in the store slowly grew into something bigger. The lesson that started with one salesman and one customer did not stay locked inside four walls. It traveled like quiet ripples across the company, then further into the community. People began talking about it, not always with the exact details, but with the essence of what had happened. The story lived on because it was real, and because it touched something in people's hearts. The chairman, though busy with many responsibilities, never let go of his mission. He visited different branches of the company, always quietly, always without announcing who he was at first. He wanted to see people for who they really were when they thought no one was watching. He listened to conversations. He paid attention to small gestures, and he watched how staff treated customers from all walks of life. Sometimes he blended in so well that no one even realized he had been there until much later. Everywhere he went, he noticed small improvements. Smiles were warmer, greetings were kinder, and patience was offered more freely. There were still mistakes here and there. No company could be perfect. But the shift in culture was real. Staff members carried the lesson forward, reminding each other when old habits tried to creep back in. The chairman knew that real change did not come overnight, but he could see that seeds had been planted and they were beginning to grow. The salesman who had once stood at the center of the storm was perhaps the clearest example of this growth. He did not quit out of shame, though many might have. Instead, he stayed, facing each day with humility and a determination to prove that people can change. At first he stumbled. The guilt made his words awkward, and sometimes his hands shook when he tried to help customers. But slowly he found his rhythm again. He practiced listening more than speaking, asking questions instead of assuming answers. The same customers who once avoided his section now lingered, surprised by his newfound kindness. Over time, he began to train new staff members, not in the way he had once carried himself, but with the wisdom he had gained. He would quietly share his story, not always giving the full truth, but enough to make the new employees understand the danger of judging by appearances. He told them, "Every person who walks in is more than you can see. Treat them that way." His words carried weight because they came from experience. The staff listened. Some were inspired, others curious, but all remembered. His mistake had become a tool for teaching, and his redemption had turned into a source of strength for the entire team. Meanwhile, customers began to sense the change in the store. Word of mouth spread. People talked about how welcome they felt, how the staff treated them with genuine respect no matter who they were or how they looked. Some came just for the products, but others came because of the experience. They wanted to feel valued, and this store had become known for offering exactly that. One day, a woman walked into the store wearing simple clothes. She looked tired, as though she had just come from work. A few years earlier, she might have been overlooked, brushed aside for someone who looked more polished. But this time, a young staff member greeted her warmly. They offered water, listened to what she needed, and guided her through the store patiently. The woman left not just with a purchase, but with a smile that came from being seen and respected. She later told her family, "It wasn't just about what I bought, it was about how I was treated." That one sentence carried further than she could have imagined. The chairman heard these stories often. He never boasted about his role in starting the change, but he listened quietly and smiled. He knew the lesson had taken root. He knew that respect, once planted, could grow into something bigger than anyone expected. The salesman eventually received recognition, not for the mistake that had nearly ended his career, but for the growth that followed it. He was promoted to a higher position, where he could oversee training and help shape the culture of the store even more. At the ceremony, he spoke briefly, his voice steady but emotional. "I once thought success was about sales and numbers," he said. "But I learned that true success comes from how we make people feel. That's the measure that matters most." The room was quiet for a moment, then filled with applause. Many knew his story, but hearing him own it with humility made the message stronger. The chairman, sitting quietly in the audience, felt proud. Not because the salesman had been punished, but because he had been transformed. The chairman believed deeply that everyone deserved the chance to learn, and here was the living proof. Outside the walls of the company, the story began to take on a life of its own. Customers shared it with friends, and slowly it spread beyond just one city. Other businesses began to hear about the transformation and took it as a model. Some managers even reached out, asking how to create the same culture of respect in their own workplaces. The chairman welcomed these conversations, always reminding them that it was not about policies alone, but about heart. "You can write as many rules as you want," he told them, "but until people believe in the value of respect, nothing will change." As the years passed, the company grew, but so did its reputation for kindness. The chairman continued his quiet visits, always testing, always watching, always reminding people that respect was not a performance, but a way of being. He never stopped carrying himself with the same calm dignity, never raising his voice, but always leaving behind the kind of silence that made people reflect. The salesman, now older and wiser, carried the lesson not only at work but in his personal life. He treated strangers on the street with kindness, listened more carefully to his friends and family, and even volunteered to mentor young people entering the workforce. He wanted them to know what he had learned the hard way, that every person matters no matter what they look like or where they come from. In the end, the story that had started with disrespect became a story of legacy. It was no longer just about one salesman or one chairman. It was about everyone who carried the lesson forward. The culture of respect had spread beyond the walls of the store, into homes, into other businesses, into the hearts of people who heard it. And though not everyone knew the exact details of that day when the chairman revealed who he was, the message was clear enough to stand on its own. Respect costs nothing, but it changes everything. The chairman knew that the lesson would outlive him, and that was enough. The salesman knew that his mistake had given him a second chance, and he used it well. The staff knew that every person who walked through their doors deserved dignity. And the customers knew, perhaps without knowing why, that they had stepped into a place where they mattered. That was the true ending and the true beginning of the story.